Yes. So my name is Alet. I'm the Audience Development Manager at the Daily Maverick in South Africa. And I'm also an alum of the Journalism AI Fellowship. So I am very happy to be here today to facilitate this very relevant and important discussion. And thank you to Polis LSE for creating this knowledge sharing opportunity. I want to introduce our panelists, and we are still waiting for Mukul. I hope he's going to join us shortly, but on your screen, you should be seeing two other brilliant and dynamic people. The first is Khalil Cassimally. He is the head of special projects for The Conversation and a consultant. He is an advocate for the user needs audience approach. If you've ever listened to a talk by Khalil, he is very passionate about that. He works with teams spanning 6 continents at The Conversation, and he consults and mentors teams and individuals at media organizations around the world. Then Darla Cameron, she is the Interim Chief Product Officer at the Texas Tribune. Darla oversees product development, engineering, and design. And she has an editorial background, if I'm right, Darla. She comes from a newsroom. From the newsroom, she was previously the managing editor for visual journalism and data visuals, leading teams in photo, multimedia, and data graphics. She has also worked for the Washington Post and the Tampa Bay Times and served on the board of investigative reporters and editors. And with perfect timing, Mukul Devichand joins us. He is the editor of audio programming at the New York Times. He is known for his work as the launch editor of NYT Audio and for creating platforms like BBC Sounds and BBC News for smart speakers. He's also co-developed a BBC AI assistant with Microsoft and several other very exciting products for the BBC. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for participating in today's discussion. Let's jump in. There will be 15 minutes at the end for audience questions. Please put your questions in the Q&A chat box as they come to you during the discussion, and we will try to get to as many of those as possible. I want to give each panelist an opportunity to tell us a little bit about the use of personalization in their newsroom or in their area of work. And I'm going to start with Mukul, who is going to share a few slides with us as soon as he's ready.
First of all, thank you. And hi, everyone. And it's great to join you and to be on a panel with I'm actually more interested in what you guys have got to say. But very quickly, we're talking about personalization and algorithms. There's a lot to be said about both, the application of that tech with journalism and how things are going at the New York Times. I'm not going to get into all of that, but just to give us something to talk about, I thought it might be useful to share something which is still very much, it's public facing, but still very much being tested, that I can show you that I have been working on with my team in audio programming, which might give you a flavor for how we are approaching this at the New York Times. So this is something which is called snippets. You'll recognize it if you're a user of the New York Times dedicated audio app. And if you're in the test group, which may not apply to that many people here. Snippets is the audio app is a front page of audio, a home of audio, a version of the New York Times that's listenable. That's the way to understand what the app itself is doing. Snippets is an experiment for a type of interface for discovering audio that we've exposed to some users in the app. It's a very visual system, sort of swipe through system for discovering your next great listen. I want to give you, first of all, a flavor of what it is, and then you'll understand under the hood to what extent we're using AI and personalization.
I'm not talking about the sweaty, sunburnt reality of summer.
How did Republican women end up like this? Published.
The Titan submersible disaster shocked the world. The Well, there's different like registers of that. This stuff that's happening right now, this definitely feels like
age well. And I think to have antenna about sensitivities is not a bad thing.
So what happens when our bodies start to overheat is our hearts start pounding faster and faster, trying to push.
I don't want to be out here selling to people.
So I won't go into, I mean, I hope you've got the flavor. Essentially what we've created there is, most of the New York Times audio app, like most audio interfaces, is like a menu, right? Like sections and then lots of different things you can listen to with certain design and UX around it. What this does is it replaces that with just a full scale feed, which takes previews, little bits of the audio from each podcast or show or thing that we offer, and allows you to swipe through until you find something that you want to listen to, and then when you do, you can press play. And each item has a visual associated with it. And I'm not going to get into masses of detail here, but there's a whole different plethora of ways that we are generating the associated video. Sometimes quite traditional ways that anyone who works in the media will be familiar with, we cut video, but also other ways involving technological tools, always human in the loop, to kind of find ways to preview bits of the audio. And there are a bunch of ways that, just to turn to the subject of this chat, there's a bunch of ways in which personalization, algorithm, and AI come into this. One or two I don't think we have time to get into here. For example, although humans help select these clips, we're using some language models to help understand the volume of audio that we have and, just sort of help us pass through which bits to select. We're also using automated voice pieces, very clearly labeled in very particular ways as in part of the audio cue. But the thing that I think it just probably gives you the best quick window into the New York Times' approach is, as you saw, this is quite a straightforward feed. And so a lot of things flow from what is the order of things in that feed and what is the order of things in your feed. So at the Times, we talk a lot about algatorial, which obviously is a lovely play on words to say, we're not going to a sort of simple personalization, maximizing, for example, engagement. But we are using that and we are mixing it in, we hope, clever ways and editorially appropriate ways with sending signals that come from my team. As the editor of audio programming, a lot of my work is, right, what are we leading with today for the New York Times audio experience? We in our more conventional feeds, we put a lot of care and attention into the order of our front page. And so we bring that thinking also to this feed, but we do also allow it to be personalized. And then I'll just end with, I mean, there's a lot of technical terms in this, but I'm probably not the person to give a very, very detailed explanation of how it all works under the hood, but this is the sort of mechanism that we're using. And some of my colleagues in the news app side have written a publicly available piece from which this slide is taken for the Nieman Lab. So if you're very interested in how this works for us, it's all actually out there. But the simple thing is these are the three kind of broad pillars of how we personalize. I'll just note that editorial signaling actually comes in different ways to each of these three. So that it's not just one bit of editorial signaling. So first of all, we're designing what pool of stories can go into the feed. That is taking editorial signal as part of deciding what that pool should be on any day or any moment. We then rank those stories. Ranking those stories for a kind of a general user also takes account of various bits of data about those stories, qualities, metadata of those stories, but also includes editorial signaling in terms of the type of story and the importance of that story in any user's feed. We then run that through a contextual bandit, which basically is a term that I can't fully explain to you, but it's it's basically dynamically selecting from various variables to create the perfect feed for you. And some of those values also include editorial signaling. And then on top of that, we apply guardrails and business rules. And those are, again, sometimes editorially based. So we also have a set of editorial rules there. So, all of which to say, the construction of this feed is something that we put a lot of attention into, and that's all I have to say about it. And it's not just me. There's a lot of very clever people working on this. So here's some pictures of them.
Great, thanks, Mukul. That's so interesting, and I have 1,000 questions, but I'm going to give the floor to Khalil quickly to tell us a little bit about how he uses personalization, or how he sees the role of personalization in his sphere of work.
Thank you. Thanks, Alet, and thanks, Mukul, for a great presentation as well. So I guess at the conversation, so first of all, we are a non-profit. So one of the key things that we are really, I guess, diligent about is the allocation of resources. And another big thing, because we are the conversation, is everything that we publish comes from academics. And in this kind of world where there's a bit of a fracture in trust between people, audiences, and basically everyone else, especially the media, I suppose, academics are still one of the most trusted professions out there. So the trust that the conversation has is something that we care very much about. So any decision that we make, is based on what happens to the trust, but also the resources that we have. So what I would say is, with the conversation, in terms of what we've done with AI so far, more of the experimentations, more of the kind of, under the hood stuff that are starting to happen, maybe less front-facing things at the moment, for all the reasons. But I suppose that this does mean that I think a lot of people, maybe in the audience, and a lot of people who are watching this, their organizations are probably similar-ish in terms of their journey with AI than the conversation. So having said that, one of the things that we are very keen about, and one of the, I guess, trend that I personally see coming, is delivering or serving user needs at an individual level. So I think that's a bit of a direction of travel for the industry. Now, that doesn't mean that in 5 or 10 years' time, everyone will have kind of their own personalized news only. I think that will happen, but it will also exist, and I hope it exists in a broader media landscape where we still consume, we still find news and information that everyone else is looking at. So there is a bit of a commons, which I think is quite important as well. But I think more and more we will be getting value at a much more personalized, individualized level. So with that in mind, if that's the aspiration, then how do we, at the conversation or at media organizations, how do we actually start moving in that direction to actually provide more personalized information to serve specific user needs for individual people? So at the conversation, we started not necessarily focusing on an individual, so the one individual. We started focusing on kind of segments, which nothing fancy, nothing new. But what we did was we started experimenting with content creation using AI. So we're talking about different formats. We're talking about addressing different needs based on all the database of trusted content that the academics who write for us have produced over the years. So one of the very early products that we've launched was a microsite that was specifically about the elections in Indonesia, which was early this year, if I'm not mistaken. It was targeted at younger audiences, and it basically presented content. So the articles, they were available, but we sort of worked on those articles and we presented the information in different formats that's much more engaging, and probably more valuable because they serve needs of those particular audiences. So that's one of the very early things that we've done. Now, that's step one. So we start learning about the segments, we start understanding what is possible with AI at a content generation point. Now, the next steps that could potentially happen going forward as we get a bit more targeted at individuals is how do we use the data that we have about audiences? How we do think about this data, right? At the moment, within the conversation, user data is not centralized. And I think that's the case in a lot of organizations as well. Now, if we want to use AI, if we want to make the most of AI to really understand the audiences, those are the things that we need to really start to think about, centralizing the data, because the data input is really important. The data input will allow for pattern recognition. Pattern recognition will allow for learning. Learning allows for the AI to give a right output and then iterate on that. So that going forward, we're starting to get, using the data that we have, the user data that we have of the conversation, creating profiles for users based on their behaviors on the site, etc. All of that is centralized. And we, start from that point and we start building profiles for people and we start delivering, very personalized content for people. So that's kind of the journey that could potentially happen at the conversation. And that's probably a journey that will happen across a lot of media organizations. And it's already happened, obviously, at certain organizations. But I think this is something that is definitely going to happen more and more going forward. I'm happy to kind of go deeper into specific things, but I think as an introduction, hopefully that makes a bit of sense.
That does. Thank you, Khalil. Darla, over to you.
Hi, good morning. Oh, it's morning for me, and that's why I have a sidekick. My daughter is still home. She has not gotten off her daycare yet. So I'm going to share my screen and talk just really quickly about how we're thinking about AI at the Texas Tribune. Thanks so much for this opportunity. I love hearing what the other panelists are doing. I think this is a good space to kind of have conversations about how we're approaching this work. The Tribune is a nonprofit, nonpartisan media organization covering statewide politics and policy in Texas, in the US. Next year, we'll launch 2 new local newsrooms. So this is a big change for us in terms of the level of information we're covering. And I think what we're thinking about in the local newsrooms is really central to the way we're thinking about using AI to personalize local information. So really geography is kind of one of the vectors that we're looking to say, okay, we have a lot of data about schools statewide, about other issues statewide. How can we make that useful to a local audience? The Tribune's been around for about 15 years. So we're kind of like an elder stateswoman of the nonprofit news ecosystem. And we've always really loved experimentation. So on AI, we are concerned that AI could be as transformative for digital media as the internet was for legacy media. And I really want journalists to be empowered to own our future on these platforms. We need to be experimenting with these tools so that we're prepared for how they're going to change how people process information. So earlier this year, our first step in this process was to set some guardrails for our work. We developed this policy. First line on here, we will not use AI to replace our journalists, but we do encourage cautious experimentation. So with that guardrails in mind, we started experimenting with AI. We're trying to kind of manifest what we want, what we want AI to do, as opposed to generic out-of-the-box solutions. We've been pitched, and I imagine most of you have been pitched a lot of tools that don't actually solve the problems that you face in your newsrooms. I don't necessarily want AI to write stories off press releases. I don't want it to write headlines. I want it to help me gather data about this really large and complex state that we cover and help us personalize that for people, save our journalists time so that they can be out on the ground to cover that ground truth about their communities. So building tools that solve those problems means we need to be able to define our problems. Digital audiences have many other places to go for information right now and for entertainment. So we need to meet Texans where they are. And we're thinking about how AI might help us make tools that help Texans navigate their daily lives in this state. Our experiments have been focused on accessibility and on efficiency. So that means making tools that kind of repackage and make our information more accessible, like a lot about what Mukul talked about for the audio tools, that discoverability, this kind of thing, where how can we make these things more easier to process for folks? And then efficiency is how can it help our workflows? How can it make us work more efficiently? We have a small team of engineers. One of them was reassigned this year to work on AI work specifically, Suraj, and he's made some internal tools, help bots, kind of like working towards experimenting with the tools first internally so that we can figure out how they could be used to serve our audience. So as we were doing this, I'm just going to really quickly note, we forgot one thing. We're doing these experiments, we're out there, and we realized we needed to ask our audience how they feel about how we're using these tools. So we joined a program with Trusting News and the Online News Association to survey our audience and their feelings about AI. What they told us was that they trust us, not AI, and that they want very, very clear disclosures when we use AI tools. They're worried about the same things that we're worried about: journalist jobs, generation without human review, environmental impact of AI. So this kind of helped us, put further guardrails on our work. Now, when we're developing new tools, we go back to this group and say, hey, what do you think? Give us feedback. So it's kind of creating that feedback loop and maintaining some of the trust, which is really, really, as Khalil mentioned, like the trust of our audience is really important in how we do this. The other way we're trying to maintain trust is by covering AI. We owe it to our audience to be informed about how this technology is being used in their worlds, and to be informed and to tell them about the ways they're going to see AI start popping up in their everyday lives. So we cover how it's happening in state government in Texas. That is all for my slides. So there we go.
Thank you, Darla. That was a great quick overview.
Yeah, I'm a fast talker, sorry.
No, it's good. So I think the thing that stands out for me really is that when we talk about personalization in the news now, it's no longer really just recommended content, right, served to users by an algorithm. It's generative AI that's now allowing us to create different content formats, such as audio and video and chatbots and quizzes, which are all kind of formats that we can use to convey the news to people in different ways that speak to them personally. And there also seems to be a trend towards hyper-personalization, where users are allowed to shape these offerings of what they see in the mornings when they open our apps and when they open the newsletter or go on our website, and tailor that to their individual interests and needs. And I think, Mukul, I want to ask you, how has consumer expectations from platforms like Spotify and Netflix influenced our own personalization strategies as news publishers? And is it, if you are Spotify or your Instagram or your TikTok, you don't really have any ethical obligations to give your users a fair or balanced representation of reality. But that's not the case for us, and how do we balance those interests?
Alet, I think you've asked possibly what is possibly one of the most profound questions facing the kind of dissemination of information in the internet now. We really are there. We used to talk about algorithms, now we talk about AI as shorthands. But really, we're talking about a similar set of technologies that are being deployed under the ownership of platforms to serve certain business outcomes into which almost all content is going. And I think it's I don't know quite how, it's very difficult to not engage with that world. And we should be engaging with that world. But I think, the reason I find this work so exciting and why it feels so important is because if we can take some cues from the many great things that we've learned about how people would rather get through information, right? People like swiping through short videos. They're quite fun. I quite like it, and many other things that people like that platforms have kind of created wonderful experiences around. If we can bring some measure of that into our owned and operated platforms, but somehow or the other thread this needle between I think one of the ways that we thread the needle is the pool of content available. Like everything that we publish ought to be trustworthy at some point. You know what I mean? But other than that, what can we do to make our experiences really competitive with those experiences and perhaps show a better way? At New York Times Audio, we try and go even further. We don't only include New York Times content. We have, a variety of of audio publishing available as well, through our own discovery mechanism. So, I think you've asked a really profound question. And look, I spend all day thinking about it. I haven't got the right answer, but and even within our organizations, we have to make sure that we thread that needle just right.
Yeah. No, I think you hit the nail on the head right there. Khalil, I want to ask you about bringing newsrooms along and bringing journalists along, right? Because all of this can be very kind of scary and pose maybe an existential threat for some journalists when they see their stories are now being rewritten in or repurposed for audio and for video, and they're now all of a sudden a quiz or being answered from a chatbot. It can be quite scary. And I know that you work a lot with newsrooms and bringing teams along, even if not necessarily in an AI context, but how do we bring newsrooms along who are a little bit wary about where this is leading, not only for the journalists individually, but also for our journalistic integrity, the integrity of our publications?
Yeah. It's interesting because one of the privileges of working at The Conversation is we are in direct contact with the academics and they are the writers. So for that experiment where we created the microsite, so we actually had to ask the academics who had written the original content whether they were happy for us to use their articles and use AI to create different formats, etc. And like everyone was like completely fine with it, and I think that's really cool. And my sense is they were all fine with it because the reason why they wrote the articles in the first place was so that they could have an impact, right? The impact could be, just give people more context, educate people, update people about things. So they wrote those articles for those purposes. So us using AI to create different formats, that's very much in service of their objectives. So there's no real disconnect. Now, talking to journalists, not at The Conversation, but elsewhere. So The Conversation is slightly different because, the editors, they work with the academics to create the articles. So the editors very rarely write original articles themselves for The Conversation. But when we're talking to journalists elsewhere, many of them will see kind of AI as, okay, in service of what we're trying to achieve. But then there is also that disconnect, as you mentioned, where journalists are a bit more reticent to use AI. And I can understand where they're coming from. Obviously, it's seen as a threat. And I think the reality is it probably is a threat for many people. But also, I think at the gist of it, we seem to, as an industry, I think we seem to have lost that kind of, why are we actually doing the journalism? So it's not just to create the content, like this is part of it, but we are creating the content, we are doing the journalism to actually do something. So for the journalism to actually lead to something. And I think that if AI is able to do this, then in and of itself, that's a good thing. Now, for those journalists who are, very much in that mindset of, we're doing this work to be in service of the audiences, it's very easy. I find it very easy to kind of bring them on the journey of AI because, again, they don't see it as a conflict. And many of them will say things like, I use AI to create more journalism or better journalism or things I couldn't do because, time, etc., right? AI is a productivity tool, basically. But then for other people who are, I guess, mostly focused on generating the content, that becomes a bit harder to kind of bring them on because maybe the end objective is different from my end objective, which is, using AI to deliver value to the audience. So then we have to kind of initially, to be honest, not really worry about those people and really focus on people who are already sort of, they believe in being valuable to audiences with AI. Just focus on them. Once you start getting the quick wins, and I think everyone will agree, once you start getting the quick wins with whatever project what you're doing with them, other people will naturally start joining. It's very unlikely that 100% of a newsroom will come on board, but initially, work with a very small group of people who believe in what we're doing, get the quick wins, more people will join the movement. Well, it will join and it becomes a movement. And that's how the kind of transformation and the culture change starts to happen within newsrooms, in my experience anyway.
Yeah. Darla, I want to ask you, so obviously there are people in this conversation from different publications, some big, some small, some have more resources, some have less resources. What would you say to someone working either in the newsroom or maybe in the product or tech team of a publication that does not necessarily have the world's resources, but would like to start on this, specifically working on, personalized news recommendations or using generative AI or any type of AI to tailor news content to individuals' needs or audience segments' needs? How do you not get it wrong? Where do you start and how do you get it right?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that I think it's helpful to acknowledge that everybody's kind of in a different place on their journey about one, like to what Khalil said, like, what is our goal? Who are we serving? What is the purpose of like why we're putting information out into the world? So kind of helping bring people along, like we're here to serve an audience. Let's define that audience. But I think for places with less resources, partnerships can work, right? Like at the Tribune, we do radical collaboration. We work with everyone. We work with tech companies. We work with other newsrooms. So kind of thinking about like really being judicious when you're trying out a partnership, when you're saying, okay, I want to work with a company to do X, like being aware of what your needs are in that situation and being able to articulate, like, this is what we're trying to do. This is the objective. How far can the tool get us in terms of answering that question, and being really judicious about selecting vendors that will be able to support your journey and give you flexibility and also maintain your ownership of the intellectual property of your content. So I think that like awareness and just that there was early on during all, like in the last couple of years during all this AI, how AI interacts with news, there were some really good like procurement guides. And I still turn to those and look at those all the time when I'm thinking about how can this help me? Because not everyone is going to be able to build massive tools, amazing things like the New York Times has. And that's fine. Like we're serving a different audience, we're serving a different need. So how do you kind of like figure out for you, keeping your audience and their needs at the center of what you're trying to do? How can you build things that meet their needs and be flexible in that space?
Mukul, you want to say something?
Yeah, I just want to do a quick +1 to Darla. Look, working at the New York Times is a privilege. But just to say, we also have those, we are thinking in very similar ways to what you just said. We also think a lot about procurement, and how to interact with this new set of technologies. And to your earlier question, Alet, I don't think we're in a particularly easy moment for any news publisher. As news publishers, we're quite self-referential and like this one can do this and that one can do that. But as a global industry, I think these technologies represent as big a disruption as any that's happened in our industry. And I think it's very, very hard to sort of actually be sure how things are going to play. In terms of some of the big picture questions. And obviously, politics and regulation will, in this country and others will play a role in that. So, yeah, just to sort of +1, Darla, I think those procurement guides are actually in some ways the best and simplest idea.
Yeah, Mukul, staying with you, I think you know, in my experience, a lot of the conversations around trust that we're having now are also actually part of this conversation. You know, and I see some of the audience members have raised this in the chat as well. You know, how do we make sure that we don't further dilute the trust that we have, people's trust in journalism, by using these AI products and choosing carefully and choosing right. And it is so difficult to know, you know, which is the right direction to go. And you know, none of us have a looking glass into the future, so we are all just trying to do our best, and trying to bring our audiences along with us. With the audio product that you're working on, I think the great thing is that you are, you know, one of those age-old arguments against personalization is that you end up showing people only a small slice of the entire offering. But this is really a diversification of the existing offering. And I think that's one of the things that AI can do so well. Take what is there already and amplify it in different kind of formats and on different platforms. Would you agree?
Yeah, no, look, I think you asked you know, another great question. So yeah, so take it aside, let's go back into the kind of more practical issues of building. So to answer your 2 points, and you know, speaking as myself, who's worked at these sorts of things both at the BBC and the New York Times, one thing I find interesting is I feel like as an editor, I'm supremely careful about you know, as I should be probably, but my instincts are to be supremely careful and controlled about the experience. And I think actually one thing I've learned is that sometimes you can make an experience in a careful, controlled way, and people think, oh, that AI is quite good. It's made a good experience. You know, people almost expect a degree of, you know, and I think one of the challenges is dealing with different customer bases at once, because we have like older users, for example, who are used to reading the newspaper, and then you have people who are living a very digital life. But I think many people expect technologies of personalization to be a part of digital experiences. And so I think we can start to be comfortable with that, you know, and we should still have safeguards and still be thinking editorially and still be, you know, I've made in automated voice, we've made a big step of saying anytime you hear it, it will say it's being read by an automated voice. That's a great safeguard, but I'm not squeamish about using it, you know, but that's uncomfortable also. I mean, I'm a radio producer by background, you know what I mean? So, you know, so things like that. So one thing is like to realize that people out there are accustomed to living in a digital world, and that's okay. And to the second point, I think that's a really interesting point. Like, actually, what we are finding is that you've got your sort of meat and potatoes, your kind of hard news, and then you've got a whole range of other storytelling that actually can get real wings through personalization, as long as you're always being aware that when something really important is happening, or some, you know, there are times you just need to kind of break the feed, you know, and just say it. But there are many times in which you might be able to bring a wonderful piece of storytelling that can really do something for someone to their attention. And I just think about those lazy Sunday mornings where you used to read the newspaper and you couldn't go on your phone because you didn't have one, you know? And actually that you could, you know, in a way, that's the thing that I would love to aspire to, is like, when can I bring that feeling of, oh, you've discovered some great piece of storytelling now that you might not have discovered otherwise, forward. And that's really the kind of gold standard for me.
Khalil?
Yeah, I really agree with everything. And just as a bit of an aside, it's I think as we move towards more personalization, etc., and I completely agree that this is, you know, increasingly expected from audiences. But as we move in that direction, I think, you know, history kind of shows that there will be a bit of a counterculture as well, and I think we're already seeing that. So, you know, the print magazines are starting to come back, for example. I mean, you know, nowhere near the heyday, but we'll start seeing those things as well. So I think it's always kind of good to have the pulse on audiences and keep talking to audiences to kind of understand how behaviors are changing, etc. And which brings me to the main thing I wanted to say, which is, ultimately we want to be valuable to audiences. And when we're talking about AI, it's always kind of based on data, right? It's fundamental. The foundation of anything AI is data. And I think for many people, when we talk about data, like people have it in their mind that, well, we need like a data team, we need data analysts, we need data architects, etc., etc. Obviously, if you have them, great. But now with like, your chat GPTs and stuff, you can do quite a lot of data analysis without going through all of those processes. So basically, again, as a productivity tool, you are moving from a point of you have ideas, you have hypotheses, and you can start validating your ideas and hypotheses just by giving them the raw data, by giving the chat GPTs of the world your raw data, asking questions, starting to find your own patterns, starting to develop your hypothesis. And you will start moving in a direction where you'll get insights and you can act on insights. And that's the first step that we need to do. Again, not everyone has access to loads of resources, but even if you have access to loads of resources, you get in touch with your data analyst, they'll put it in a backlog, you have to wait, when you can now, by yourself, start developing things using AI tools. And that sets you on the path of better understanding your audiences, which will set you on the path of being valuable to audiences, however, in however way you want to do it. That's something to keep in mind as well.
That's great. That's so true. Thanks, Khalil, for that. Darla.
I also think I like what you said, because data, we think of data as like a spreadsheet. That's kind of like the base level of journalists are afraid of math, and that's how they think of data. But data is kind of everything. Like a story is data. There's units of information within a story that, when repackaged, could be presented and like without losing the truth of it, the like thing we verified. How can you kind of repackage and redistribute that? And also acknowledging like a massive feed of audio or anything is great. No one is going to have time to listen to all of that. Like kind of acknowledging that a lot of the longer things we produce, it's harder for them to find an audience. So I'm interested in how AI can help us like take those snippets of information and also just think more about that in the future, we're going to need that kind of first party data about people's interests in order to better personalize the news and serve it to them. So how do we make sure that the systems we're using and building can support like this AI optimization instead of SEO optimization, like what we've spent a lot of time building for in the recent history?
Right. Mukul?
Yeah, just in the spirit of kind of radically agreeing. What Darla said is right, but I think, Khalil, I'm going to take something that you said and probably misquote you forever now, because I think you said something like about 20 minutes ago. I think you said something like, the experience is part of the journalism, and I think that's something. I think that's a really good thought to hang on to, because why do we do this? We don't just do it so that any one story presented in the pristine form that we have liked creating has reach. Of course, that's why we do it, and we want to make those stories. But also, I think we want to do the thing that we exist in the world to do, right? We want to inform people, play a role in democracy, hold power to account and all those things. And so the experiences that we create also do that. And having a destination homepage as an example, just one example, is itself a service. And so if that can be something that leverages data, personalization, and a degree of this tech in a way that still performs its function, that's still journalism, and that's something that has been interesting to come to. So I'm gonna misquote you liberally, if you don't mind, Khalil. That was a really good insight.
Well, I think we are actually out of time for this discussion. So I want to thank you so much, the panelists, for your time and your insights. It's been really interesting to me, and I can see that there's been quite a few questions in the chat that's been answered. So I hope you find it interesting and useful, and good luck on your personalization journey. And I hope, yeah, everyone found this useful and insightful. Thanks. Thanks, Tepo.